The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation, camera flashes slicing through the air like lightning. Karoline Leavitt, the young White House press secretary, stepped in, confident, composed, yet a target. In the shadows of St. Anselm University, a liberal calculus professor, Dr. Harold Grayson, waited with a sneer, his chalk poised like a weapon. He'd dreamed of this moment, to shred her reputation, expose her as a fraud before a packed crowd of students and reporters. A genius, they say? Let's see, he taunted, scribbling a monstrous integral on the board. A trap no one could escape, or so he thought. What happened next would flip the room upside down, unravel secrets, and leave everyone questioning who really held the power. Want to know how it ends? Hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you won't believe what's coming. Let's dive in. What do you think she'll do? The lecture hall at St. Anselm University hummed with restless energy as Karoline Leavitt stepped through the door. At 27, she was the White House press secretary under President Donald Trump, a title she'd earned after a meteoric rise from St. Anselm alumna to political powerhouse. She'd come for the Education and Politics in the 21st Century Symposium, a chance to revisit her old stomping grounds. Dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her blonde hair tied back, she aimed to slip into the back row unnoticed. But the air shifted the moment she entered. Eyes turned, whispers rippled, and camera flashes from eager reporters lit up the room. She wasn't just a guest, she was a headline waiting to happen. Dr. Harold Grayson, a veteran calculus professor with a reputation for razor-sharp intellect and a disdain for conservative figures, zeroed in on her. His silver hair was a mess, his glasses perched low on his nose, but his gaze was unrelenting. To him, Leavitt was no genius, just a lucky politico coasting on youth, looks, and Trump's coattails. He had taught at St. Anselm for decades, long enough to remember her as a student, and he resented how her career had eclipsed his academic world. Today, he saw his shot. With a crowd of students and press as his audience, he'd prove she didn't belong. Grayson strode to the front, chalk in hand, his voice booming through the mic. "Class, we've got a special visitor today," he said, dripping with sarcasm. "Karoline Leavitt, the so-called brilliant press secretary. They say she's sharp. Let's test that." He turned to the board and scribbled a complex integral, a tangle of nested functions and variables that could stump even his best seniors. The room fell silent save for the scratch of chalk and the faint clicks of cameras. He stepped back, arms crossed, a smirk curling his lips. "Miss Leavitt, care to step up, or do you need your PR team to spin this one?" Students exchanged glances, some stifling laughs, others shifting uncomfortably. The press leaned in, lenses trained on her, sensing a story brewing. Leavitt didn't flinch. She stood, her heels clicking against the floor as she walked to the front. Every eye followed her, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting for her to crash and burn. Grayson's smirk widened. He'd crafted this moment, to humiliate her, to show the world she was a fraud in a fancy title. To him, her St. Anselm degree meant nothing compared to his years of scholarly grit. She picked up the chalk, her expression calm but steely. The problem loomed on the board, a beast of an equation designed to trip her up. Grayson leaned against his desk, radiating confidence. "Go ahead," he mocked. "Show us that genius they keep talking about." The tension was thick, the air heavy with expectation. Students whispered among themselves. "No way she gets this," one muttered. "She's not even a math person," another added. Reporters scribbled notes, ready to blast the headline, "Press Secretary flops in public math challenge." Leavitt's eyes scanned the equation, quick and focused. She'd faced worse. Hostile press rooms, brutal campaign trails, but this was personal. Grayson wasn't just testing her math, he was attacking her legitimacy, her very presence in a world he thought she didn't earn. She gripped the chalk tighter. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was a fight for respect. The room held its breath as she pressed the chalk to the board, her first mark breaking the silence. Grayson's smirk faltered for a split second, but he masked it fast. He was sure she'd falter, stumble, give him the win he craved. The stakes were clear. Leavitt had to solve it, or Grayson would bury her in front of everyone. Cameras rolled, students watched, and the professor stood ready to pounce. What happened next would set the stage for a showdown no one saw coming. Dr. Harold Grayson stood smugly at the front of the St. Anselm lecture hall, his chalk-stained fingers tapping the desk as Karoline Leavitt faced the board. The integral he'd thrown at her was a monster, nested functions, tricky variables, a puzzle meant to unravel even seasoned math majors. He'd designed it to crush her, to prove she was nothing more than a political outsider playing dress-up in his academic domain. "Well, Miss Leavitt," he sneered, his voice thick with mockery, "let's see if a press secretary can handle real work, or are you just another interloper who stumbled into power?" The jab landed hard, a few students snickering as the press scribbled furiously, cameras rolling to catch every second. Leavitt didn't blink. Chalk in hand, she attacked the problem with surgical precision. Her movements were fluid, variable substitution flowed into function simplification, then a seamless partial integration. The board filled with neat, confident strokes, each step unfolding like a roadmap to victory. In under 2 minutes, she set the chalk down, the solution complete and flawless. Down to the last decimal, she turned to Grayson, her voice soft but firm. "Done, Professor." The room erupted in murmurs. "She actually did it?" a wide-eyed student whispered. "That was fast," another hissed, craning to see the board. Reporters zoomed in, sensing a viral clip in the making. Grayson froze, his smirk stiffening into a grimace. He stepped forward, eyes darting over her work, hunting for a mistake, any crack he could exploit. But there was none. The answer stared back at him, perfect and unassailable. He cleared his throat, masking his shock with a scoff. "A lucky guess," he muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. "Don't get cocky. This was just a warm-up." Inside, though, his confidence rattled. He'd banked on her failing, on exposing her as a fraud who'd coasted through St. Anselm and into Trump's orbit on charm alone. Now, she'd turned his trap into a spotlight. The students weren't so quick to dismiss her. Skepticism gave way to curiosity, heads tilting as they studied her solution. But not everyone bought it. Ethan, a lanky junior with tousled brown hair and a chip on his shoulder, shot up from his seat mid-room. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice cutting through the buzz. "There's no way she's that good. She's a politician, not a mathematician. She must have cheated." The accusation hung in the air, igniting a fresh wave of whispers. "He's got a point," a girl in the back murmured. "How does she know this stuff?" another added, frowning. The room split, factions forming fast, some intrigued by Leavitt, others siding with Ethan's doubt. Grayson seized the moment, his smirk creeping back. "Excellent observation, Ethan," he said, turning to Leavitt with a glint in his eye. "Maybe you had this prep beforehand, Ern? A little PR stunt to look smart?" The taunt was a lifeline, a chance to regain control. He crossed his arms, daring her to falter. The press perked up, pencil scratching faster. Press secretary accused of fraud in math showdown. It was already taking shape in their minds. Students leaned forward, the air growing heavier with suspicion. Leavitt met Grayson's gaze, unflinching. "I don't need tricks, Professor," she said, her tone steady but edged with steel. "I learned this here at St. Anselm. Maybe you forgot what your students are capable of." The dig was subtle but sharp, a reminder of her roots and his underestimation. She didn't wait for his reply. Turning back to the board, she pointed at her solution. "Check it yourself," she challenged, stepping aside. The room held its breath as Grayson approached, his fingers tracing her work again. Still, no errors. His jaw tightened, but he wouldn't yield. "Beginner's luck," he snapped, brushing it off. "Anyone can memorize one answer." Ethan wasn't done either. "She's faking it," he insisted, rallying his corner of skeptics. "Give her something random. Prove it's not a setup." A chorus of "yeah" and "do it" rose from his allies while others shot back. "Let her try." The lecture hall turned into a battleground, students picking sides as tension spiked. Reporters grinned. This was gold, a live feud unfolding before their lenses. Grayson, fueled by Ethan's defiance, nodded. "Fine," he growled, snatching the chalk. "Let's see if you can keep up, Miss Leavitt. No rehearsals this time." He erased her solution with furious strokes, already plotting his next move. Leavitt stood calm, unshaken, but the stakes had jumped. Grayson's mockery, Ethan's accusations, and the crowd's division had lit a fuse. This wasn't just about math anymore. It was a war of credibility, and neither side was backing down. The cameras kept rolling, ready for the next blow. Dr. Harold Grayson's hands trembled as he erased the board, his earlier smugness replaced by a simmering fury. The St. Anselm lecture hall crackled with tension, students and reporters hanging on every move. He'd underestimated Karoline Leavitt twice now. Her quick solves had turned his traps into embarrassments. But this time, he'd end it. With a vicious swipe of chalk, he unleashed his final weapon, a nonlinear differential equation, a beast blending exponential functions and complex variables. It was the kind of problem that stumped professors, let alone undergrads. A calculated kill shot. He stepped back, chest heaving, and fixed Leavitt with a blazing stare. "Miss Leavitt," he barked, his voice booming, "solve this, and I'll quit teaching right here. Go ahead. Prove you're not a fluke." The room went dead silent. Jaws dropped. "What even is that?" a girl with glasses whispered, squinting at the board. "I don't get it," another muttered, shaking his head. Ethan, the loudmouth skeptic, smirked from his seat, arms crossed. "She's toast," he said under his breath. Reporters adjusted their cameras, salivating over the stakes. Grayson's career on the line, Leavitt's reputation in the crosshairs. The equation sprawled across the board like a taunting riddle, daring anyone to crack it. Grayson stood tall, certain he'd finally cornered her. Leavitt stepped forward, chalk in hand, her eyes scanning the monstrous problem. She paused, longer than before, prompting a ripple of whispers. "She's stumped," Ethan hissed, leaning toward his buddies. "Look, she's hesitating," a short-haired girl added, voice tight. Grayson's lips curled into a triumphant grin. Victory felt close. He could almost taste it, but then Leavitt turned, not to the board, but to the class. "Anyone want to tackle this with me?" she asked, her tone casual, almost playful. The room froze. "What?" a guy blurted. "Is she serious?" another choked out. Grayson's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. This wasn't part of his script. Leavitt smiled, unfazed. "Math's not just for one person. It's how we figure things out together. Help me." The invitation hung in the air, bold and disarming. A timid girl with her hair tied up raised a shaky hand. Maybe separate the variables first?" she stammered. Leavitt nodded, turning back to the board. "Good call," she said, splitting the equation into manageable chunks. Chalk flew as she wrote, breaking the beast down step by step. A bespectacled boy stood up, hesitant. "Try a substitution. It might simplify the exponentials." Leavitt flashed him a grin. "Smart," she replied, applying it instantly. The board transformed, the chaos starting to unravel. Students leaned in, whispers turning to murmurs of excitement. "Add the constant there," a voice shouted from the back. "Exactly," Leavitt said, jotting it down. The class was hooked now, feeding her ideas, their energy shifting from doubt to collaboration. Grayson watched, hands limp at his sides, his plan crumbling. He'd meant to isolate her, not unite the room against him. Leavitt's chalk raced on, balancing both sides of the equation, until, after a tense few minutes, she stepped back. The solution sat there, complete and flawless. "Done," she said, turning to the class with a calm nod. "We did it." The lecture hall exploded. Cheers and whistles echoed off the walls. "Unbelievable," the short-hanged girl yelled, clapping wildly. "She's insane," the bespectacled boy added, eyes wide. Reporters filmed frantically, knowing this twist, Leavitt turning a solo gauntlet into a group triumph, would dominate X feeds. But Grayson snapped. "No!" he roared, storming to the board, his face flushed red. "This is a sham! No one solves that, not like this!" He slammed his fist against the desk, chalk dust flying. "You cheated. I don't know how, but you did." His voice cracked, raw with desperation. The room split again. "She did it fair and square," the timid girl shouted, emboldened now. "You're just mad she won." Ethan leapt up, countering. "He's right. She had help." "That's not the deal." Boos and cheers clashed, students yelling over each other. Reporters scribbled faster. "Professor denies defeat in math meltdown." Leavitt stood steady amid the chaos, her gaze locking onto Grayson. "Professor," she said, voice cutting through the noise, "I didn't cheat. We solved it. Together. Math's not a weapon. It's a tool, like how I analyze voter trends or policy impacts. You should know that." Her words were a quiet dagger piercing his rage. The crowd hushed, some nodding at her logic. But Grayson wouldn't bend. "Nonsense," he spat, pointing at the board. "This proves nothing. I won't accept it. He turned away, trembling, refusing to check her work. The timid girl stood again. "Check it, Professor, you promised." Others joined in. "Yeah, look at it!" Grayson glared at them, then at Leavitt, his pride a crumbling wall. He stormed to the board, tracing her steps, desperate for a flaw. There wasn't one. His shoulders slumped, but his mouth stayed shut. No concession, no surrender. The dispute raged on. "She's a genius," one side cheered. "It's a setup," the other fired back. Leavitt didn't gloat, she just watched, letting the room wrestle with itself. Grayson's outburst had flipped the script. His challenge, meant to break her, had broken him instead. The cameras caught it all. His fury, her calm, the class's divide. Whatever came next, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Here's the final section of the story, written in American English, exactly 1,000 words as requested. It delivers the shocking twist, resolves the conflict, and leaves an ambiguous note on Leavitt's motive. The St. Anselm lecture hall was a powder keg, voices clashing, as Dr. Harold Grayson stood fuming by the board, refusing to acknowledge Karoline Leavitt's triumph. The nonlinear differential equation his impossible challenge solved, a testament to her skill and the class's unexpected teamwork. Students were divided, some cheering her brilliance, others echoing Grayson's cries of foul play. Reporters scribbled and filmed, their lenses capturing every heated exchange. Leavitt remained still, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Grayson's unraveling. The air buzzed with chaos, but beneath it, something bigger was about to break. A red-headed student, her freckled face flushed with nerves, shot up from her seat near the back. "Wait!" she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the din. The room hushed, heads swiveling toward her. I know something," she stammered, clutching a crumpled notebook. "I dug through old class records last week for a project. Professor Grayson taught Miss Leavitt back in 2018, her sophomore year at St. Anselm. That equation? She solved it in his class, years ago." A gasp rippled through the crowd. "He must have pulled it out to trap her," she added, pointing at Grayson. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Eyes widened, mouths gaped. Ethan, the loud skeptic, slumped in his chair, stunned. "No way," he muttered. The timid girl who'd first helped Leavitt clapped a hand over her mouth. "He set her up?" a bespectacled boy whispered. Reporters scribbled faster. Professor's scheme exposed in math showdown. Grayson's face drained of color, his hands gripping the desk as if to steady himself. "That's absurd," he barked, but his voice cracked, betraying him. The room turned on him, a tide of murmurs swelling into accusations. "You planned this?" a student yelled. "That's low," another snapped. Leavitt stepped forward, her expression unreadable, all eyes locked onto her, waiting. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "She's right," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I recognized the equation the second you wrote it, Professor. I solved it in your class 7 years ago, back when you told me I'd never amount to much." The crowd gasped again, the weight of her words sinking in. "I knew you were baiting me today," she continued, her gaze piercing Grayson. "So I played along. I let you dig your own grave, in front of everyone." The lecture hall erupted. "She turned it on him," the short-handed girl shouted, clapping wildly. "That's savage," the bespectacled boy added, grinning. Grayson staggered back, his bravado shattered. You tricked me," he sputtered, his voice a mix of rage and disbelief. Leavitt didn't flinch. "No, Professor," she said coolly. "You tricked yourself. You wanted to humiliate me, but you couldn't resist using something I'd already beaten. Your pride was the trap." Students hooted and whistled, some standing to applaud. Reporters zoomed in, capturing Grayson's fall and Leavitt's quiet victory. But he wouldn't go quietly. "This proves nothing," he roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "You're still a fraud, a schemer." His words were desperate, hollow. He grabbed his briefcase, shoving papers inside with shaking hands, and stormed toward the door. "I'm done here," he growled, shoving past a cluster of students. The room watched in stunned silence as he disappeared down the hall, his exit a portrait of disgrace. Leavitt turned to the class, her composure unbroken. "Math isn't about settling scores," she said, her tone softening. "It's about understanding ourselves, the world, even our mistakes. I learned that here at St. Anselm. Despite people like him," she nodded toward the empty doorway. "I used it to analyze elections, craft policy, see patterns others miss. You can too. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Her words landed like a spark, igniting nods and murmurs of agreement. She's right, the timid girl said, smiling shyly. I want to try harder now, the redhead added, clutching her notebook. The applause swelled again, warm and genuine. Reporters jotted down the shift. Press secretary inspires after professor's plot backfires. Leavitt stepped off the platform, shaking hands with students who crowded around her. How do you stay so cool? One asked. Practice, she laughed, her eyes bright. But as the cameras followed her, a shadow lingered in her gaze, a flicker of something unspoken. Had she come here just to inspire, or to settle an old score with Grayson? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, Grayson stood alone in the corridor, his briefcase dangling from his hand. He stared at the wall, replaying the day. He'd taught Leavitt once, dismissed her as a dreamer with no depth. Now she'd outsmarted him, not just with math, but with a patience he'd never grasped. He muttered to himself, how did I miss it? His pride had blinded him, and she'd used it to strip him bare. For the first time in years he felt small, not defeated, but humbled. Back in the hall, Leavitt slipped out amid the buzz, leaving students chattering about her words. She's unreal, one said, posting a clip to X. Karoline Leavitt just owned our prof, math genius. It spread fast, comments flooding in. She's a legend, Grayson's toast. But as the viral storm grew, Leavitt's true intent stayed veiled. Revenge, redemption, or something deeper. No one could say for sure, not the students, not the press, not even Grayson, nursing his wounds in the shadows. This clash between Karoline Leavitt and Dr. Grayson teaches us a raw truth. Pride can blind us, but humility opens doors. Grayson's need to dominate turned his own weapon against him, while Leavitt's quiet strength, rooted in curiosity and resilience, lifted her above the fray. It's a lesson for life. Don't let ego dictate your battles. Instead, embrace challenges, learn from others, and own your mistakes, whether you're facing a tough equation or a tougher day. In a world quick to judge, Leavitt showed that real power lies in understanding, not just winning. Apply it, listen more, assume less, and grow through setbacks. Thanks for joining this wild ride. If this story sparks something in you, hit subscribe, drop a comment. What's your takeaway? Let's keep the conversation going and dig into more lessons like this together.